There was a time when Mark could predict Lauren's every move, every little habit that made her who she was. The way she'd hum to herself while folding laundry, the way she'd scrunch her nose when reading something that didn't quite make sense. They used to talk for hours about nothing and everything, and he used to be the one who made her laugh without even trying. Lately, though, something was off. He first noticed it in the small things. Her laughter, for one. It wasn't the same. It used to be full, genuine, spilling out of her before she could stop it. Now, it was more calculated, softer, like she was performing rather than actually feeling it. He wasn't even sure when it changed, only that one day he caught himself wondering if she was truly happy or just pretending to be. And then there was the way she'd started taking more time getting ready before going out. Lauren had always taken care of herself, but this was different. She'd linger in front of the mirror longer, carefully applying lipstick, straightening her hair, choosing outfits that weren't just nice, but noticeably more flattering than before. When he asked where she was going, she'd always say something simple: brunch with the girls, errands, a late meeting, but the explanations felt hollow. There was a time when he wouldn't have questioned it, but now he wasn't so sure. Her phone, too, was always face down. That alone shouldn't mean anything, right? Except it never used to be that way. She used to leave it out, answer texts openly, even ask him to check it for her if she was busy. But lately it was different. If it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly and then turn the screen off. If he walked into the room, she'd casually slide it into her pocket or flip it over. At first, he told himself he was imagining things. Everyone was more private with their phones these days. But once he saw a notification pop up, just a name, nothing more, and the way her face tensed before she hurriedly swiped it away, he knew it wasn't just in his head. Their marriage hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, it was effortless. They were young, in love, full of dreams that hadn't yet been worn down by reality. They stayed up late talking about the future, took spontaneous road trips just because, laughed until their stomachs hurt over the dumbest things. But then life happened. Careers took over, bills piled up, and eventually, kids came into the picture. The exhaustion of sleepless nights, school runs, and work stress chipped away at the easy, joyful thing they once had. Conversations became about schedules and responsibilities, not dreams and feelings. Date nights turned into something they should do rather than something they wanted to do. And in the process of it all, somewhere between late meetings and early mornings, they lost something. Mark had felt it slipping, but he never imagined it would come to this. He told himself it was just a rough patch, that things would settle, that they'd find their way back to each other like they always had. But now, watching Lauren from across the room as she smiled at something on her phone before tucking it away like a secret, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Doubt. And that terrified him. The party was already in full swing by the time Mark and Lauren arrived. Jason had gone all out, as he always did. Strobe lights flickered across the crowded living room. Fake cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and a mix of Halloween hits and bass-heavy club music pulsed through the speakers. People were drinking, laughing, and letting loose, the air thick with the scent of pumpkin spice and alcohol. Mark adjusted his pirate hat, feeling a little ridiculous in his last-minute costume. He grabbed a cheap plastic sword and a loose-fitting shirt that vaguely resembled something from a pirate movie. But next to Lauren, he felt downright invisible. She had gone all out this year. Lauren's Catwoman costume clung to her like a second skin, the tight black fabric accentuating every curve. The bodysuit zipped up the front, stopping just low enough to hint at something more, and her dark mask added an air of mystery that made her even more captivating than usual. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she moved, effortless and confident. She looked incredible, undeniably breathtakingly gorgeous, and Mark should have felt lucky, proud even, but instead, there was a gnawing discomfort in the pit of his stomach, because she wasn't looking at him like that tonight. From the moment they walked in, Lauren had been distracted. At first, he chalked it up to the usual party atmosphere. Friends catching up, people mingling, drinks flowing. But then he noticed where her attention kept drifting, or rather, who it kept drifting to. Nick, Rachel's husband. Tall, athletic, dressed as some sort of vampire with a perfectly tailored black coat and just the right amount of fake blood at the corner of his mouth. He was laughing, talking animatedly, completely at ease. And Lauren? She was watching him, not in the casual way you glance at someone during a conversation. No, it was different. Her eyes lingered a little too long. She laughed a little too easily at his jokes. And when he spoke, she leaned in just a little closer than necessary. Mark tried to brush it off at first. It was a party. People were drinking, chatting, having fun. But as the night went on, it became harder to ignore. Lauren wasn't just spending time with Nick. She was gravitating toward him. Anytime Rachel got pulled away into another conversation, Lauren and Nick ended up together. At one point, Mark saw her place a hand on Nick's arm, her fingers resting there for just a second too long. It was an innocent enough gesture, except it didn't feel innocent at all. The worst part? Nick noticed. He wasn't exactly encouraging it, but he wasn't discouraging it either. He smiled at her, matched her energy, let the moment stretch just a little longer than they should. Mark tried to shake it off. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe it was the dim lighting, the drinks, the music messing with his head. But then he caught the look. Lauren glanced at Nick when she thought no one was watching. Admiration, curiosity, something else. Mark's stomach twisted. He had never doubted Lauren's loyalty before, not truly. But tonight, standing there in a stupid pirate costume, watching his wife laugh a little too freely with another man, he felt something he never wanted to feel. Jealousy. And underneath that, buried just deep enough to ignore for now, fear. The party had started to blur together. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. But Mark was no longer enjoying any of it. His drink sat untouched in his hand as he stood near the edge of the room, eyes scanning for Lauren. He spotted her in the kitchen. His stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. Nick stood close, too close. Their heads were tilted toward each other, voices hushed beneath the party's noise. Lauren's lips were slightly parted, her expression tense, yet engaged, like they were discussing something that mattered. Something that wasn't just small talk. Mark took a slow breath, trying to push away the unease tightening in his chest. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just his paranoia creeping in, twisting something innocent into something ugly. Then Lauren laughed, soft and breathy, and Nick leaned in just a little more. Mark couldn't ignore it anymore. He set his drink down and started toward them, his footsteps firm, his pulse thundering in his ears. Neither of them noticed him at first, not until he was nearly in front of them. Lauren flinched slightly when she saw him, straightening like a guilty kid caught breaking the rules. Nick, though? Nick smirked. That was all it took. Mark clenched his fists, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay calm. But then Nick did something worse. He chuckled, shaking his head, and muttered, "Relax, man. We're just reminiscing. Lauren and we've got some memories, you know." Time stopped. Mark didn't remember thinking, didn't remember deciding. 1 second, he was standing there, Nick's smug words hanging in the air. The next, his fist was crashing into Nick's face. The impact sent Nick stumbling back, his head colliding with the wall so hard that the sound cut through the party like a gunshot. Silence. For a second, nobody moved. Then, chaos erupted. Rachel screamed, rushing to Nick, who groaned as he slumped against the wall, clutching his jaw. People turned, gasping, whispering. Jason, the host, swore loudly, moving forward as if to break up whatever this was. Mark barely noticed any of it. He was staring at Lauren. She wasn't running to Nick. She wasn't yelling at Mark for hitting him. She just stood there, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, caught. And that's when he knew. He had been waiting for her to deny it, to call Nick a liar, to look at Mark with anger, with outrage, with something other than the stunned silence that was filling the space between them. But she didn't. Rachel didn't either. Nobody was denying anything. The truth settled over Mark like a weight, cold and suffocating. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. And his marriage, his life, was about to shatter. Mark didn't remember much about leaving the party. His head was buzzing, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The only thing he knew for sure was that he needed to get away. Away from the house, away from Lauren, away from the betrayal that was now a permanent scar on his life. Lauren tried to follow him as he stormed out, calling his name, but he spun around so fast she actually flinched. "Don't," he growled. "Don't even think about coming home. You're not welcome there." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. She just stood there, looking at him with wide, guilty eyes, mascara smudged beneath them. For the first time since all of this started, he saw it, the real her. Not the version of her that had been acting distant, not the polished woman in her seductive costume, but the one who had made a choice and was now facing the consequences. Mark didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked away, fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his palms. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove straight to his mother's house, the one place he knew he'd find some form of comfort. It was almost midnight when he knocked on her door, and when she answered, her face was filled with concern even before he spoke. "Mark," she said, pulling her robe tighter around her. "What's wrong?" He couldn't find the words. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy, and the only thing he could manage was, "Can I stay here for a while?" Her expression softened instantly. She stepped aside and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in." That was the first night. The next few weeks were a blur of bad decisions. Mark shut off his phone, ignoring the flood of messages and missed calls from Lauren. He didn't want to hear her voice, didn't want to give her a chance to explain, because what was there to explain? She had betrayed him. She had let another man take what was supposed to be sacred between them, and she hadn't even denied it. Instead of dealing with it, he drowned himself in alcohol. Every night, he found himself at a bar on the other side of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions and no one cared about anything other than the drink in front of them. He'd sit at the counter, ordering whiskey after whiskey, letting the burn distract him from the ache in his chest. Time lost meaning. Days bled into nights. He didn't go to work. He barely ate. He just existed, trapped in an endless cycle of drinking and trying to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option, because a few days later, he found out that his humiliation wasn't just his own anymore. It had spread. The story of what happened at the party, his punch, the betrayal, everything, was now all over the internet. Jason had posted it anonymously. At first, Mark didn't believe it. He only found out when an old coworker texted him a link. The post was brutal, a detailed retelling of the night from a third-person perspective, but the details were unmistakable. Even though names weren't mentioned, everyone in town knew exactly who it was about. And people were talking. Nick, furious about being humiliated, wanted to sue. But Lauren and Rachel had shut him down. Mark wasn't sure why. Maybe they felt guilty. Maybe they didn't want even more attention on their mistakes. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Everyone knew, and there was no coming back from it. Mark hadn't seen Lauren since the night of the party. Weeks had passed, and he had ignored every single one of her calls and messages. At first, they were frantic, voicemails filled with apologies, texts begging him to talk. Then, they became quieter, shorter, as if she had finally started to understand that there was no easy way out of this. But now, as he sat across from her in a quiet corner of a cafe, he wondered if he had made a mistake agreeing to this meeting. Lauren looked different. She wasn't dressed up like the last time he'd seen her. No flawless makeup or seductive outfits. Just jeans, a simple sweater, hair tied back. She looked tired, eyes slightly puffy, fingers fidgeting around the cup in front of her. For a brief moment, he remembered the woman he fell in love with, not the stranger who had betrayed him. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said quietly, staring down at her coffee. Mark scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "That's what they all say, right?" She winced but nodded. "I know I deserve that." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Then, finally, Lauren took a deep breath and spoke. "You stopped wanting me, Mark. she said, her voice raw. For months, maybe even years, I felt like I was invisible to you. You'd come home exhausted, barely look at me, barely touch me. I really tried to get your attention, to make you see me again, but nothing worked. He clenched his jaw, already feeling the blame shifting in her words. I was working my ass off to provide for us, Lauren. I wasn't out screwing other people. She flinched. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying I felt unwanted. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup, and she hesitated before continuing. Do you remember that night? The one where I put on that lingerie? The one you used to love? Mark swallowed hard. He did remember. She had gone all out. Candles, soft music, a sultry smile. But he had been exhausted. The weight of work, bills, and life itself had drained every ounce of energy from him. And instead of turning to her, he had picked up his phone, mindlessly scrolling through adult content, looking for something easy and detached. Lauren's voice broke the memory. I walked in on you, Mark. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He hadn't realized she had seen him. That was the moment I knew, she whispered. I could never compete with that. You didn't reject me because you were tired. You rejected me because I wasn't enough for you anymore. Mark felt something twist deep in his gut. It was true. He had neglected her. He had ignored her efforts, overlooked the little things she did to bring them closer. That night, she had tried to reach out, and he had shut her down without a second thought. But did that justify what she had done? No. Then Lauren said something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just Nick, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It started with Rachel. Mark's breath hitched. What? She wiped at her eyes and nodded. Rachel and I, it happened first. It was a mistake, but then it happened again. And then Nick found out. He wanted to be a part of it. And I let him. Mark went still. The words hung in the air between them, each one a nail in the coffin of the life he thought they had. Lauren shifted uncomfortably. I was lost, Mark. I didn't know who I was anymore. And Rachel, she made me feel something again. And then it spiraled, and before I knew it, everything got out of control. Mark wanted to hate her. He wanted to get up, walk away, and never look back. But instead, he exhaled a long, slow breath and said, if you really regret this, if you really want to fix things, then there's one condition. Lauren looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. Anything. You cut Rachel out of your life. Completely. She froze. She's been part of your life for years, but she's also part of the reason you destroyed our marriage. Mark continued, his voice firm. If you want a second chance, she's gone. No texts, no calls, nothing. You choose our marriage or her. Lauren's lip trembled. For the first time, she realized that fixing this wasn't going to be easy. And Mark, for the first time, he wasn't sure she was going to make the right choice. Mark had given her the choice, and deep down, he already knew what her answer would be. At first, Lauren hesitated. She promised she would try, that she would create distance between herself and Rachel. But Mark saw the truth in her eyes before she even admitted it. She wasn't willing to cut Rachel out of her life. And that meant she wasn't willing to fight for their marriage. The realization stung, but it also brought clarity. Lauren had never truly belonged to him, not in the way he had belonged to her. There had always been parts of her that she kept separate, places in her mind and heart that he would never be able to reach. And now he understood why. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped choosing him. The divorce was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. It took nearly 2 years to finalize. 2 years of paperwork, court dates, financial disputes, and endless negotiations over assets. They had built a life together, and now they had to tear it apart piece by piece. Lauren fought to keep things amicable. She reached out more times than Mark could count, asking if they could talk, if they could find some middle ground. Sometimes she cried, told him she missed him, that she wished things had been different. But Mark, he remained unmoved, because the truth was she didn't regret what she had done. She only regretted getting caught. And that was something he could never forgive. Even after the divorce was finalized, Lauren didn't disappear. She would send him messages out of nowhere, little reminders of their past, as if nostalgia could undo the damage. She asked to meet, to talk, to reconnect. She tried to convince him that they could start over, that people made mistakes, that love should be enough. But love hadn't been enough to keep her faithful. So Mark let her go. And this time, he didn't look back. 2 years had passed, but sometimes it still felt like yesterday. Mark had spent those years rebuilding himself from the ground up. At first, the pain was unbearable. Every morning felt like a battle. Every memory of Lauren like a ghost haunting the corners of his mind. But time had done what it always did. Slowly, the wounds scabbed over. The nights of drinking alone faded. The anger that once burned in his chest dimmed into something quieter, something manageable. He had found a new rhythm, a new version of himself. And tonight, for the first time in years, he was at a Halloween party, Jason's of all places. The same friend who had unknowingly turned his world upside down with that anonymous internet post was now standing at the bar, laughing loudly, handing out shots to anyone willing to take them. But Mark wasn't here alone this time. He glanced over at Emily, his date for the night. She wasn't Lauren, and that was the best thing about her. She was easygoing, warm, with a genuine smile that didn't feel rehearsed. They weren't serious yet, but for the first time in years, he wasn't looking at love like a battlefield. He wasn't afraid of getting close to someone again. Then it happened. He saw her. Lauren. She was across the room, drink in hand, standing near a group of friends. She hadn't changed much, still effortlessly beautiful, still carrying herself with that quiet confidence. But when her eyes met his, something flickered in them. Recognition, regret, maybe something else. Mark didn't look away. He didn't feel anger, didn't feel sadness. He felt nothing at all, and that was how he knew he had finally moved on. Lauren held his gaze for a moment longer, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something. But there was nothing left to say. She wasn't his anymore, and he was finally okay with that. Mark turned back to Emily, smiling as she nudged his arm playfully, unaware of the moment that had just passed. The past was behind him, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so uncertain.